Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Unauthorized Disclosure Podcast. I'm Kevin Gastola, one of the show's hosts. Unfortunately, Rania Kalik is not able to join us this week, but you'll know exactly why pretty soon. But joining us is Zoe Alexandra, and she is a journalist with People's Dispatch, and we're having her on to discuss the election in Honduras. So thanks for joining, Zoe.
Thank you so much for having me.
And so this election in Honduras, I'll just say, first off, one thing that stands out to me as we're talking is the fact that the United States government is not going to contest it and is planning to recognize it as a free and fair election. And we could probably come back to that. But I think what would be good to start people off on is to describe, this election, kind of lay out what was at stake, and introduce people to who Xiomara Castro was, and why it's significant that she was able to triumph at the polls.
Definitely. I mean, as you said, these were historic elections in Honduras. There was a 68% voter turnout rate this Sunday, November 28th. Hondurans went to the general elections. They elected the president, the members of Congress, and local authorities like mayors and other regional authorities. It is important to recognize that this was an overwhelming victory by Xiomara Castro. She won with over 53% of the votes against Nasri Asfura. Nasri Asfura is the candidate from the National Party of Honduras. Xiomara Castro from the Libre Party of Honduras, which for these elections made a broad alliance with several progressive opposition parties in Honduras. There's, many reasons why these elections are Honduras. I'll just start off with the first is that it's brings an end to 12 years of National Party rule in Honduras. The National Party, the far-right party of Honduras, came to power in 2009 through a coup d'etat. They, helped overthrow the democratically elected President Manuel Zelaya, who at the time was part of the Liberal Party. Through this coup d'etat, supported by the military, and of course, I'm sure we'll get to in a bit, supported by the United States, they imposed their rule, and over the past 12 years have really carried out a nefarious agenda against the people of Honduras in order to enrich themselves, to extract resources and concede parts of Honduran territories to transnational corporations. And so in this context, during the 12 years of the coup, a very broad resistance front emerged called the National Front for Popular Resistance. And this was kind of the primary grouping that was resisting on the streets the coup d'etat. There were mass protests following the coup d'etat. And from this National Resistance Front emerges the Libre Party. And one of the key leaders during this moment was Xiomara Castro, who is, of course, the wife of Manuel Zelaya, who was overthrown in the coup. And so Xiomara Castro, I mention this because it's important to recognize that she has a long trajectory of, engaging in popular struggle, in organizing and resisting what has been what Hondurans call the narcodictatorship of the National Party. And so in these elections, Xiomara Castro and this opposition alliance, they win 53% of the vote. As I mentioned, massive turnout rate, 68% of the population came to the polls to vote. And I think it's important to note this because, in the elections throughout the pandemic, there's been, notably historically low turnout rate for elections in many countries across the world, and especially in Latin America. But I think this high turnout rate really points to the fact that people in Honduras were, very, very anxious to enact change in the country, and we're not going to tolerate more years of the National Party. I was, on the streets in Honduras on Sunday, going to different polling stations and hearing from other journalists and activists within Honduras, what was happening at other polling stations. And it's important to note that even though, Xiomara Castro was able to clinch this, impressive victory, that this didn't happen without, some instances of voter fraud by the National Party. They were really fighting tooth and nail to try to remain, in government, in power, to hold on to this, hegemony that was achieved through militarization and coup d'etat. There were, incidents for weeks leading up to the elections of them handing out domestic products. So, refrigerators, stoves, straight up handing out money to people, food baskets, all in the effort to just win their vote. They knew that the victory of the Libre Party was imminent, and they were trying to do everything they could, even on election day. At many polling stations, I heard from so many people saying that the National Party was, for example, asking people to go with their phones inside to take pictures of the ballots. So then afterwards, they would show the ballot and say that they voted. In other places, members of the National Party would, for example, target older people who were not able to, or were maybe confused by the voting process, and direct them to, okay, vote here for the National Party. And because of the history of the undermining of democracy by these far-right forces, the people of Honduras this time around were very prepared. And so, activists from the Libre Party and just, normal citizens who were just very wanting to defend democracy and this electoral process were, keeping watch at all of these polling stations, calling out any irregularities when they were able to see them. So, just highlight that this was an incredible process in terms of civic participation, in terms of taking an important step of restoring democracy in Honduras. As you mentioned, the U.S. State Department and government, of course, has recognized the results. And I think this is truly due to the fact that on one hand, there was going to be no way that they could undermine these results. I mean, if we look at 2017, the advantage that Salvador Nasrallah and the opposition alliance had over the National Party was a much slimmer margin. This time around, it's over 20 points that Xiomara Castro was leading, in comparison to the National Party. So there's no way you can manipulate this and say, no, actually, the trend changed. It's just impossible. And on the other hand, I think the U.S. government is conscious of the fact that a National Party government actually is quite bad for the U.S. in the sense that this misery and extreme neoliberalism that has been imposed on the Honduran people has caused tens of thousands of them to, be forced to migrate, just given the fact that there are no opportunities, given the fact that poverty is at over 70% in the country, and there's just no opportunities. So, Hondurans have been one of the largest nationalities that have come to the United States southern border, fleeing the situation of violence, of misery, and of lack of opportunities. So I think the U.S. realized, actually, we can't deal with another 4 years of a government that's corrupt, a government that is doing absolutely nothing for the people, and that only around election times will give these meager crumbs to the people of, one refrigerator here, one food basket there. And that's all they're willing to give to the people. They're not really willing to, build a country that people can stay in and thrive in.
I'll get to the corruption of the current presidential administration and what has led up to this, which you're alluding to pretty specifically by describing why the U.S. would tolerate this correction in the country. Mm-hmm. But I have the statement from the State Department on the election in Honduras. It's not very long. I think it's worth reading just because we see a left candidate triumph at the polls. And we've seen in the last months a complete opposite attitude when it comes to countries in Latin America like Venezuela and Nicaragua, and how they remain relentless in their position that those countries should not be run by leaders who are left wing. I mean, it's pretty clear that it's an ideological decision to oppose them, and because they also are represent interests that threaten the capitalist class, so they oppose those leaders of the two countries. But in this case, what we're hearing, and I'll just read. The United States congratulates the people of Honduras on their election and Xiomara Castro on her historic victory as Honduras's first female president. We look forward to working with the next government of Honduras. We congratulate Hondurans for the high voter turnout, peaceful participation, and active civil society engagement that marked this election, signaling an enduring commitment to the democratic process. The United States and Honduras enjoy a long-standing relationship grounded in shared values, commerce, culture, and family ties. The United States will continue to support Honduras in strengthening its democratic institutions, promoting economic growth, and fighting corruption and transnational crime. So, that end sentence is loaded with a lot of issues that we can get into here before we conclude our conversation. But, I will note that one thing that isn't really working in the United States government's favor is that she is the first woman president of Honduras, and to oppose her probably wouldn't be great for the image of the United States.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, I think it's just overwhelming in the sense that they can't so blatantly disrespect the will of the Honduran people. I think right now they're, taking a conciliatory approach. What can we, trying to, make an ally with Xiomara Castro. She's already expressed that Honduras is open to having new types of international relations. Honduras can be considered kind of the Israel of Central America, or the Colombia of Central America, in the sense that it's been a steadfast U.S. ally in all of its, regional plans of imposing, it's not only its neoliberal agenda, but also being a kind of lily pad for all of its actions against neighboring countries. I mean, looking at the 80s with the guerrilla movements in Guatemala and El Salvador and Nicaragua. I mean, Honduras was the kind of home base for the U.S.'s offensive against these movements in its, Cold War proxy wars. And so I think that's also really important to remember. It's also been the home to Chiquita, to United Fruit Company for decades. And so they're really important economic interests that the U.S. has in Honduras, military interests, and political interests that it really doesn't want to lose. I think it's going to try to, work with this government to, maintain these ties. But I think what's clear, and especially what's been clear if you look at Xiomara Castro's government plan, is that while they've said that they're not going to cut relations with the United States, they will begin relations with other countries. Knowing that they have a lot of economic reconstruction to do. I think they'll definitely be turning to China for a lot of these, much more relaxed and beneficial loans, infrastructure projects that come with a lot less strings attached than any other kind of project that it engages with the United States. These will be key elements to, I think, be looking out for. And let's leave it there.
Yeah, so let's get into this last 12 years of this narco dictatorship. And can you tell people about who Juan Orlando Hernandez is? He's the president right now, but what he represents as a figure. I mean, I've seen things describing just the massive corruption that he's engaged in as a person, as a politician, and the fact that a lot of what is wrong with Honduras is largely symptomatic of what he's been capable of doing as president. And so I think it's important for people to know what people were voting out in Honduras, and also to know the complicity and the support that the U.S. government had shown. And while Donald Trump escalated it significantly, as my understanding, there was still support there before Donald Trump.
Juan Orlando Hernandez was elected in 2013. Again, as I mentioned before, in 2009, there was a coup d'etat. So already, democratic order, rule of law in Honduras had been subverted. There was a great debate among social movements about whether to participate in the, following electoral processes, whether this would legitimize this coup, whether it would legitimize this kind of subversion of the democratic order. And in 2013, Juan Orlando Hernandez was elected president. The best way to characterize Juan Orlando is that he has been engaged in drug trafficking. He is corrupt, and he has, fundamentally contributed to the militarization of the country of Honduras and to the systematic violation of human rights in the country. in 2009, when Manuel Zelaya was overthrown, one of the key arguments that was used by the right wing was because Manuel Zelaya was calling for a referendum to see if the people of Honduras wanted to rewrite their constitution in a national constituent assembly process. This was a long-standing demand of social movements because they believed that the foundation of, the Honduran state, the institutions, was, designed for, perpetuating inequality, designed for the exclusion of the majorities and the masses. And so this was, their way to kind of rethink the state and rethink how the state would function in the country. And the right wing said that this National Constituent Assembly was just a ploy by Manuel Zelaya to be reelected, because in Honduras, according to the constitution, presidents can only stand for one term. So it's interesting because when Juan Orlando Hernandez comes around in 2013, he's elected president. He continues what had been, started under the de facto President Micheletti and his predecessor, Porfirio Lobo Sosa, of, just creating and implementing a neoliberal project of concessioning the territories for mining, for hydroelectric projects, for other sorts of extractive projects in the country. Juan Orlando continues this, deepens the militarization of the country. And then in 2017, ahead of the elections, he actually, suspends several of the Supreme Court justices, reappoints them, and they essentially modify one of the clauses in the Constitution and say that he can run for re-election. So the same excuse that was used by the right wing to overthrow the government of Honduras in 2009 was exactly what Juan Orlando actually did illegally in 2017 and 2016 ahead of the presidential elections. So that's just kind of one example of the kind of, rotting away of the institutionality that took place under Juan Orlando Hernandez. He was also, part of his government oversaw the creation of the special zones for economic and development and employment. This is the ZEDEs, which essentially allows transnational corporations to buy pieces of land in Honduras and create special economic zones. We've seen special economic zones in other parts of the country, but what's distinct and unique about the special economic zones in Honduras is that, whoever is administering this zone can decide what legislation can be applied in this zone. So, for example, I was speaking to a lawyer last week about these special economic zones, and he told me that one of them actually has the legislation of the U.S. state of Delaware. And what does the U.S. state of Delaware have? Well, very low taxes and, very favorable investment rates. And this means that they don't have to respect the labor legislation of Honduras. They don't have to respect, the taxation system that they would normally be subjected to. This has, been a huge point of contention because it's seeing the complete violation of Honduran sovereignty and, the erosion of the sense of nation and in a territorial sense. This is, one of the examples. Another would be granting the, just unrestrained granting of different mining concessions, hydroelectric project concessions, without consulting, for example, the indigenous communities, the Garifuna communities that are ancestral communities that live in these areas. Honduras is ratified the International Labor Organization Convention 169, which says that before granting any of these licenses, you have to consult the territories. And then, and this is in terms of his policy actions as president. Then when you look at his, corruption and drug trafficking, in 2013, for his presidential campaign, it has been proven in a U.S. court based in New York, a district court, that Juan Orlando Hernandez and his brother Tony Hernandez used funds from drug trafficking to fund his presidential campaign. This is, written by a prosecutor in New York. Juan Orlando Hernandez is named as co-conspirator in the case that currently has Tony Hernandez in prison in the United States. So he is, completely proven to have been, benefiting from drug trafficking and being an active participant in drug trafficking of tons of cocaine, from South America through Central America and, of course, the United States. This is, a key issue. And it's really extraordinary when you think of it. The fact that a U.S. court has recognized that a president that the U.S. government has, steadfastly supported is actually, accused of drug trafficking. And then, I'd say the final point would be the mass corruption that's been taking place during his presidency, and also the, establishing kind of impunity for those who have been involved in corruption schemes. So many, there would be so many things to say about corruption with Juan Orlando Hernandez, but one can really look at, for example, the pandemic when, countries were really struggling. Honduras is one of the weakest public health systems in the region, which of course is due to these 12 years of brutal neoliberalism, just hollowing out the public sector completely. They made a contract with a private company to build campaign hospitals, like many countries did during the pandemic, because they didn't have the capacity to deal with the amount of people who were getting sick. And instead of actually building these hospitals, they built about 10, I believe. Instead of building how many they had paid for, this money went straight into the pockets of members of the government and National Party. Also under Juan Orlando Hernandez, he dismantled the UN-created commission to investigate corruption in Honduras. They said that this was no longer going to be, they kind of took away the legal possibility of this commission being able to investigate, and said that they couldn't investigate prior corruption actions. So, just completely taking away the teeth from this this body, and it completely giving impunity to all of these corrupt officials, not only in the executive, but legislators, mayors, all levels of government that have been involved in corruption. And then just to add, finally, of course, the systematic violation of human rights that took place during his government and the government before him. As I mentioned, that the granting of concessions of territory across Honduras has been kind of the root of many social and conflicts in the country, in the terms of indigenous communities, peasant communities, Garifuna communities opposing these projects, these dam projects, mining projects, logging projects. There's massive cultivations of African palm in Honduras. And so these have been the root of many disputes of communities engaging in very, very steadfast resistance to these projects. And the response of the Honduran government has been militarization, has been repression, has been, campaigns of stigmatization, of, collusion from the armed forces and paramilitary and private security to harass activists, to persecute them, and in many cases, even assassinate them. I mean, the case of Berta Cáceres is one of the most emblematic examples of this. She was subjected to, for years before she was assassinated, to a campaign of threats, intimidation, and violence by members of the army, by members of the private security. And this was all done, and it's proven in investigations about her assassination, with members of the army, members of the government, and members and the major stakeholders in the company, which are, from the elite class of Honduras, the Atala family, and of course with the international banks from Europe and the United States that had investments in this project. She's one of the most emblematic cases because it represents what's been happening to activists across the country. And thankfully, there's been able to be enough attention on this to really understand this kind of web of impunity that's been woven during the Juan Orlando Hernandez presidency, and just the complete violation of the rights of indigenous people, of activists, and of just everyday Honduran people.
So before I go through, I want to go through some of the issues that Honduras has that were mentioned about, that were described in the U.S. State Department's response to the election. But first, I think it's important to ask you this question because I'm curious, and I think others who listen and watch our show would like to hear from you on this question, which is the presidency of Donald Trump. Could we consider this a kind of response to what he represented in the United States. Although he is no longer president, I'm very keenly aware of, although these policies exist, although the policies of deporting Hondurans and sending them back to their country and not allowing them into the United States when they are trying to leave for a much better economic situation, so to speak, that still he ramped that into overdrive while he was president, that he increased his support for the right-wing regime in Honduras, that a lot of this was more out in the open. We know this for other Latin American countries, that the Trump administration was just more brazen. And I'm wondering if you've talked to anybody or if you've had any experience with this question of, is the election of Xiomara Castro possible because of just how far the Trump administration was going in trying to advance the agenda of U.S. empire?
I think it's interesting. So Donald Trump was the first world leader to recognize the fraudulent re-election of Juan Orlando Hernandez in 2017. Immediately following him, a string of other countries, also recognized this, even though it was, recognized even by the Organization of American States as being full of irregularities. But I would say that in Honduras, I think the sentiment, because of decades and over a century of U.S. imperialism, they don't really see a difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. And of course, I think the approach of Trump on the border was extremely challenging, but and the amount of deportations, the horrible images you would see on TV. But to be honest, for most people, the coup happened under Obama, and it was supported by Hillary Clinton. She's right. Said it publicly. Berta Cáceres, in an interview said this is on Hillary Clinton. She had that very clear. Many people in Honduras have that very clear. And I think it's also been clear that under Joe Biden, there hasn't been a shift in policy towards Central America. They don't want immigrants at the border as much as Trump didn't want it, and they're having to take similar responses that Trump took. I think the only reason why the U.S. is forced to recognize this victory is because of how overwhelming the victory was. There would be no way for even a Trump government to not recognize this victory. It was the National Party itself that was able to kind of manufacture the fraud with, of course, support from these U.S.-backed institutions, and then of course with the stamp of approval from the United States. But this time, even the National Party was not able to kind of manufacture their victory. Had they done this, we might have been able to see a different response from the United States. That would be interesting to look at. But I think that the U.S. is only recognized this because they're really forced to. And this is really a product of the struggle of the Honduran people and the, mass struggle that they've been waging over the past 12 years. And then, as I mentioned, this huge participation and, watching the electoral process, observing the electoral process, alerting to the irregularities, and making sure that international bodies and journalists and institutions were also being aware of what was happening.
Yeah, that's a good answer. I mean, I think people who follow us are very aware too that the policies from Democrats and Republicans have been almost identical when it comes to the ways they deal with these issues. And I think that's why I wanted to just bring into our conversation the fact that the state, so a lot of, what we talk about here is the insidiousness of U.S. State Department policy that is being pushed on the people of Honduras, and Hillary Clinton being a representative of that as Secretary of State a long time ago. But then obviously others have come along and been the Secretary of State since then. But they have something called the U.S. State Department has something called the root causes strategy, which sounds like they are, willing to help Honduras get to the bottom of their problems. It sounds like a radical policy, but maybe the only radical thing is that it's probably making these issues worse for the people of Honduras. And so they say that like these different pillars for helping Honduras is to address economic insecurity and inequality, combating corruption, strengthening democracy, promoting respect for human rights, labor, and free press, countering and preventing violence, extortion, and other crimes, trafficking networks, organized crime, etc. But then combating sexual, gender-based, and domestic violence. But I think it's worth getting into some of the very entrenched problems that have been created through U.S. support of governments over the last decades in Honduras. And I think it's, people would probably like to hear us discuss this. So I'm aware that there's been a lot of militarization of society in Honduras over the last, 15 or 20 years. That's certainly been something that has been increased. I know that the response to the presence of gangs in Honduras was to deploy more military resources, was to also increase support for the police. The US government has been a believer that the way you enforce law and order in Honduras is to increase police forces and to I assume create kind of like security zones that can target that probably end up targeting communities. Would you get into this? What life is like in Honduras, the presence of police and military?
Yeah, I mean, this document is quite interesting because wouldn't it be great if the labor rights of Hondurans were respected? Wouldn't it be great if they had, right to a dignified living wage, to healthcare, to education? All of these things are not possible because the U.S. supported a military coup against a democratically elected leader. And then the subsequent governments, proceeded to take away people's rights. I think it's funny that they talk about the rights of women because one of the first actions by the coup regime was to, for example, make birth control legal, make the morning after pill legal. So, I mean, and in addition to, a ton of other things that directly affect women, I think healthcare is such a crucial element of what's been that's been denied to the people. There was a famous corruption case where the government made a deal with some pharmaceutical company, and it was completely ridiculous because they were buying pills that were filled with flour, and so people were medicated with pills that were filled with flour. And they were dying. This was not medicine. This was, and the government was directly responsible for, the deaths of hundreds of people, if not thousands, who were, denied their basic right of access to healthcare because, just siphoning off money and making these false contracts was more important to the national government, to the National Party government, which the U.S. has steadfastly supported. So, I mean, it's quite interesting that they want to, combat all of these social ills that are a direct product of their policy towards these governments. I mean, one of the easiest ways they could have, reversed the deterioration of conditions was to not support a fraudulent election in 2017. The response to the 2017 fraud was mass protests there were road blockades in over 100 different locations across the country. This is a small country. And people, the citizens, social movements, popular movements were enraged. And in response to these protests, the US trained military police, which was a body that was created, no surprise here, following the US-backed coup in 2009. All of the officers trained, some in West Point, some in the United States, others trained by the massive amount of troops, of US troops that are actually stationed in Honduras at one of the largest US military bases in the region, Palmerola. And the military police was directly responsible for killing on the streets of over 35 protesters during the protests against electoral fraud. So, this is, I think, a clear example of this militarized response. And, just to get into the general context, as I mentioned, the military police was a, body that was created following the coup and with the specific kind of purpose to target the opposition, to respond to social unrest, The increase in militarization was seen in terms of, more troops, but also more training from the U.S. and preferential treatment for former military officers in, for example, buying shares of public companies, in entrance to key roles in the government. And so you see not only the mass militarization of the territories. It was truly remarkable to see about 10 trucks full of soldiers arrive to a small town just days before election day to keep watch over the electoral process. But not only the militarization of the territories and the, just militarization of everyday life, but also just the militarization of institutions, of having people who were, part of this body just have way more access to political institutions. This is a key aspect as well. In terms of everyday life, I think there's a lot of comparisons to be drawn between Honduras and Colombia in terms of using the military, using the police, which should be separated. One is the military would be under the Department of Defense, and then police is more a security issue. But these have kind of been merged, and so that there's a militarized response to social problems of the people. And so on one hand, you have the proliferation of gangs and the maras, which is clearly, we can't, deny this is a direct response to the deterioration of socioeconomic conditions. And these criminal gangs have, of course, support from the government. As I mentioned before, Juan Orlando Hernandez was, part of mass drug trafficking schemes. And so, there are, of course, these major links to be drawn between the elites and these criminal groups, the top tiers of these criminal groups, but the people who get impacted by the militarization, by this persecution is, the lowest level members of these gangs. So many, young people who are forced to turn to, gang-related activity, maybe because of desperation, but also just because they're forced to, because they're living in neighborhoods, they're living in poor neighborhoods where these gangs are controlling. They're forced to turn to the gangs. Maybe they're killed, maybe they're put in prison. This has been the response of the government, and this is a direct result of U.S. policy that has supported the militarization of the territories, a militarized response to social problems, and of course, providing funding and training for this. So I think for most Hondurans, and I think there's many graffitis that say it very quickly, what they want is the U.S. to get their hands out of the country. So stop the participation in these special economic zones, which strip not only Honduras of its sovereignty, but also of labor rights, and just generally eroding this nation. Get military U.S. troops out of Honduras, stop training the Honduran military, stop occupying large parts of Honduras for their geostrategic interests. And stop having such a oversized role in the political activity. I think many people commented to me, oh, the Honduran military is completely controlled by whatever the U.S. said. So before the elections, the Brian Nichols, who I'm forgetting his exact title, but I think he's the commerce liaison, I think, of the State Department. He was in Honduras a couple of days before the elections, and he met with the military. And I think they were, realizing that Xiomara Castro was going to win and trying to kind of set contingency plans. They have, under the National Party rule, they were granted, a ridiculous amount of power in this country. So what people want for a lot of these social ills to go away, it's going to require a lot of investment. I think I mentioned before that they're looking towards China to help with infrastructure development. And of course, they have to undertake a lot of policy changes within the government and within Honduras. But this doesn't, what the U.S. can do in this situation is get out and leave the Honduran people to be able to, chart their own destiny and engage in relations in a sense of, on equal terms, not of the U.S. coming in and imposing what they think is the best policy for the country.
All right. So as we wrap here, why don't you tell people about peoplesdispatch.org? And I'm going to put an article of yours up on screen just so people can see the website. You're doing fantastic work, and it's not just you, it's other people at People's Dispatch But go ahead and let people know about some of the work you're doing. I mean, it's really great to follow it, and I'm glad you're out. And you're talking to us. Is it all right if I tell people where you're at right now?
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking to us from Brazil, and you were in Honduras earlier, and you're all over, and you're covering really important struggles.
Yeah, well, that's what we try to do at People's Dispatch, is an international media project, which first and foremost tells stories of people's movements from across the world, seeking to give a voice to the people who are on the streets, who are pushing for popular demands to, restore dignity, to build people's power, and to, fight against capitalism and the other structures of oppression in our world. We are partners of the International People's Assembly, a platform of over 200 people's movements, trade unions, and left political parties. And so really our job is to report and speak with people who are in struggle, also cover international news from a working class perspective, and really give the perspective that mainstream media won't give you, from the movements, from the most affected sectors, and a lot of the team is based in India, so we have very strong coverage of Asia, of farmers movements in India, covering trade unions in sub-Saharan Africa, and so definitely invite people to follow if you're looking to be updated, which you should be, on the struggles of the people across the world.
Thank you. I really appreciate you giving me the time. It was really good to get an update on Honduras, and it definitely looks like, at least for the moment, there is hope for some of the population in Honduras, and that's definitely good, given how bleak and grim a lot of our world seems to be. So when the people triumph, I think it's reason for a little bit of excitement, and to pay attention, and to give them our support, and say that we're glad that they're able to make some progress in their struggle. So thank you for joining the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast, Zoe.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for watching and listening to the Unauthorized Disclosure weekly podcast. If you could support our show and help us keep going strong, go to patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure, or rockfin.com/unauthorized dis, or you may also find us at Spotify. On Spotify, you can search for the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast and become a follower or subscriber of the show. You'll get access to the exclusive content we post, as well as you'll be the first to know when we're going to do live streams. And with people like you who are loyal and give to the show every month, we are able to keep going. We've been doing this for more than 8 years now, and we'd like to do it for a few more. So thank you, and we'll be back soon with another episode of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast.